My name's Justin the Clue, and I'm here today with
Will Sloan.
And you're listening to the Important Cinema Club. And today, we're talking about the coolest thing cinema can offer, says a 12-year-old boy who just discovered Quentin Tarantino, the long take.
And we're doing this podcast all in one take.
That's right. No edits, he lied. There'll be seamless edits that we're going to try to, Will will turn toward the microphone on his back, and we'll cut, and it'll continue from there.
Yeah, cutting out all the parts where I, break down in tears.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm such a fraud.
Where I'm yelling at you, and I'm like, do better. So, the long take is something that, as a filmmaker myself, you kind of get obsessed with because it's this quantitative idea of cinema as something that anyone could see and go, wow, that is impressive.
I think for kind of young people who are getting into film, the sorts of filmmakers that young men, let's face it, gravitate towards are people like Tarantino, Scorsese,
Brian De Palma.
These filmmakers who announce their presence very strongly in a very kind of macho way. We are the authors of this film. Film is our mode of expression. And the long take is this very obvious manifestation of that authorship. It's them declaring, look at what I can do, look at what I can do.
It's the most Brechtian device you can use stylistically, because the idea of a long take, the viewer has to be aware of it for it to have an impact like the director wants. Mm-hmm. This idea that I'm sitting in the audience and I realize, whoa, this take has been going on for 2 minutes. That's crazy. Because otherwise, my mom or my dad sitting in the audience watching a movie, they're never going to realize that. That will never have an impact on them. That fact that this goes on without a cut for a really long time. So it's really only for the cinephiles or people that want to be impressed by the filmmaker.
But is a long take really cinema? Isn't montage cinema?
Mm-hmm.
Does a long take always have to be this showy bit of acrobatics with actors coming in and out of everywhere?
Or could it be a Chantal Ackerman looking at a tree blowing the wind for what seems like 40 minutes?
Could it be Andy Warhol parking his camera in front of the Empire State Building?
Yes. Well, this is what we're going to talk about on this episode. I wanted to talk a little bit about the director, Mikhail Kalatozov, who is a Georgian filmmaker who made films like Cranes Are Flying, which won a Palme d'Or when it came out in 1957. But the most famous film, I would say, in his filmography is one called I Am Cuba, which came out in 1964 to no acclaim and kind of pans until it was rediscovered and re-released in the 90s by people like Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese.
Those are the two who I think put their name on the re-release.
Yeah, it wasn't them that discovered the film and re-released it, but they're the ones that were the champions of it to get it out there.
And they also helped get it restored.
So I Am Cuba was this big giant project that was organized by the Cuban government when they had suddenly come back into power. They were a communist country and Russia wanted to get involved. And the way that they helped out was by doing this kind of mega production.
This is a movie that sort of follows the 1959 Cuban Revolution through 4 stories. Mm-hmm. The first is about a humble fruit peddler and his fiancée who live in a shanty town, and the fiancée ends up prostituting herself to an American tourist. There's another story about a hardworking farmer whose land is sold out from under him by his landlord. There's a story about a student rebellion that is suppressed. And finally, there's a story about an apolitical farmer who ends up becoming a reluctant revolutionary.
And everything that Will said just there are the entire stories. There's no real twists or turns. It's mostly anecdotes or just kind of illustrations of a situation that would lead the country to go communist.
But really, this movie's all about the visual style.
That's all it is. Mm-hmm. And if you listen to the director and the cinematographer who had a really strong hand in making the movie, Sergei Uruzevsky, it's that they wanted to create an idea of poetics on screen. And in their mind, poetics would be created by these long, impossible takes. And that this kind of disconnect from what's happening, this idea of what you're watching is perfection, it would reach a kind of transcendental level.
Well, when this movie came out, it was panned by critics in Cuba and in the Soviet Union, I think also, as being bourgeois.
Exactly. It was too lush and it was too in your face with his style.
And frankly, I think they've got a point. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is not a direct film. I mean, so the most famous shot in this movie comes very early on. It's at this luxury tourist hotel in Havana before the revolution. Revolution, and you see all of these tourists reveling,
having fun,
kind of ugly Yankee guys, but they're also, beautiful women in bikinis, and the camera, there's a beauty pageant going on, and the camera, like mills around on this rooftop deck, and then the camera floats down to another rooftop deck lower where there's a pool. And then finally the camera follows a woman into the pool and it's submerged into the pool. Now, if that sounds familiar to you, it's because Boogie Nights ripped it off for that famous scene.
And I think that says a lot about what long takes mean to filmmakers, because if you listen to Paul Thomas Anderson talk on the commentary for Boogie Nights, like this idea of these lengthy show-off he takes is very important to him. And that's something that would go away as he continued to make movies.
I get the charge of being bourgeois because...
Oh, yeah. This seems awesome, though.
Well, yeah, like there's nothing humble about it. It's a movie that you're always kind of at a distance from it. You're always kind of marveling at the technique. You're not necessarily invested in the stories of these humble people. And also, it makes pre-revolutionary Cuba look awesome.
It does, especially when you capture it in a way that every frame looks perfect. This is a film that took 2 years to make. I think it was supposed to take only a few months. And the director and the cinematographer, they would do the Akira Kurosawa thing of, let's just wait a number of days so the sky looks perfect so we can film it, which is everything that communism should not be, trying to get it perfect.
There's another early scene where the camera is floating through a nightclub. Actually, the visual style kind of reminds me of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
It does completely, yeah. But all these bamboo trees, it keeps panning past.
It's always coming up really close to people's faces
in wide angle lenses, and they're laughing in a way to kind of make them look horrific, but it just kind of looks goofy and fun.
Yeah, and in this nightclub scene where you're seeing all these kind of vulgar American tourists who are looking at the sex workers and being very lascivious and lustful, and then you see drunk American soldiers go by, and the sense is that there are these Americans who use this country basically as their toilet.
Yes.
But I mean, it still looks really cool.
And it's a film that as a piece of propaganda fails completely. It's not emotionally involving in the way that I think they wanted it to be. The idea that if you capture something so beautifully that it will impact the audience, because what you're seeing is even the farmer who goes through the situation where his land's taken away from him and he ends up burning it and kind of lighting everything that he owns on fire and dying in the process, and with this take, you can only marvel at the take, which starts on him 2 feet away from a flaming building, and the camera pulls out in a 2-minute shot until he's just a point in the distance.
Yeah.
And all you can think about when you watch that is not the suffering that this guy is going through. It's, wow, this is beautiful, and how did they do that? Which is a completely different feeling than what propaganda or even emotionally compelling cinema in the way that we think that it should work.
I do like this movie, though.
Yes.
I find it quite thrilling.
I think it's great, and I think that it's great in the way that everyone, when it was re-released, kind of approached it. This idea that, look at this technique, look at this beauty, and that's what the movie is.
So that's a movie where, the form and maybe the content of the long takes are at odds.
Yes.
But let's explore some other uses of the long take.
So when you think of a long take, what is the first thing that comes into your mind specifically?
The first one that comes into my mind is Goodfellas.
Which I rewatched that shot because this is the one that when you go to film theory, and I went to a class when I was in high school at a university, they show you first. They're look at this is a long take. Because this is a take that has a story mechanism in it.
Henry Hill's on top of the world.
Exactly.
He's so powerful. He can go anywhere he wants. He can make the fucking Red Sea part,
And he could just go through the back of things to get to the front where he's important. And that's what the take means. Do you think that it has value in that? Because I think it does.
Oh, I think, it tells you everything you need to know about him at that time. And also, it's a thrilling technical accomplishment. I mean, it's okay that it shows off. It's fun to watch Scorsese able to choreograph this complicated maneuver. Henry Hill going into the basement of the Copacabana, walking through the kitchen, all the cooks and the waiters moving past. Then he goes up to the audience, and then Henny Youngman is on stage. It's fun, in the way that a ballet is fun.
And it's a take as well that, in the wake of it, doesn't even look that impressive. It's fine. I watched it again, and you go, okay.
Well, let's see you do it, Justin.
I have. If you looked at the film Impossible Horror and Teddy Bomb.
Actually, Teddy Bomb has a good long take as well.
Yeah, it does.
The POV shot, right?
Yeah, it goes for quite a few minutes. I'll talk about that at the end of the episode and why I approach it that way. But, in the wake of that, like, everyone wanted to be like, oh, this is a long take, this is a long take. Because the one that I think of is Touch of Evil, which is Orson Welles' like big, like all over the place take that appears differently in the versions that you watch. Because in the theatrical version of Touch of Evil, if no one has seen the shot, go and watch it. It's still technically like jaw-dropping at this point in time, but it starts like on a bomb, and then it follows the bomb as it goes through this like Mexican border town.
And you're also introduced to two of the main characters, Charlton Heston and Janet Leigh. You find out they've just been married. You know, you find out that Charlton Heston is a cop, and he's just busted this case. He's going off on his honeymoon. And you also get a sense of, you know, the space of this border town, and you get a sense of the atmosphere of the border town, this decadent kind of seedy, ugly atmosphere where like the law is maybe not very powerful.
And I think that one of the reasons that Orson Welles went with this long take is that by starting it on the bomb, it just creates this idea of suspense, right? Which is, it's not only like, when is the take going to end when you realize that it's been going on for this long, but when is the bomb going to go off? Because what a lot of directors do when they do this long take is that it ends with like a big climactic thing, in this case, a car exploding. And it's also this long take, you lose the kind of flow of where the bomb is because you're following all these characters, and then suddenly the perspective changes to Charlton Heston and Janet Leigh, and you're like, wait, where's the bomb? Like, where is it at this point in time? And that's what that kind of stylistic technique does.
But as you alluded to earlier, there are also two versions of this scene. The one that Universal put out theatrically against Orson Welles' wishes has the titles over it, you know, starring Charlton Heston, Orson Welles.
With music as well, playing behind
with
it.
Henry Mancini's music, which you can still hear bits of in Orson Welles' preferred version. But Welles' preferred version had the sound of the streets, kind of an Altman-esque tapestry. A lot, you hear voices, you hear car sounds, you hear seedy sounding music, you hear a bit of Mancini's music, and I like both versions. I love the Henry Mancini score, but I think Welles' version gives you a better sense of decadent atmosphere of this border town, and the way that the border is going to be a metaphor for this sort of no man's land where the rule of law doesn't exist.
Well, what the long take also does in that situation is kind of position by having sounds coming in and out, the idea that like there's more going on around this movie, that like when you're panning across things, like there's other stories like music or bits of dialogue coming in, but then you move away from it and you're just kind of ignoring it. It goes on, it exists on the borders of this, but this is not what you're focusing on. Like in I Am Cuba, the director loves to like pan across faces as if going like, look at all these people all have stories. There's like one scene in a village when like a white rich guy who just woke up from sleeping with a woman that he paid realizes that like he's in a decrepit village and all these people are miserable and stuff like that. And that's what the long take achieves, is like as you pan, it's the cumulative effect of it, of that like you don't have the cut to release that tension, and that you see all of these faces. In the same way that Touch of Evil, you can hear all these sounds and stuff like that. It's like a lived-in world.
Another thing that Touch of Evil does is announce Orson Welles' comeback, which in this case...
Like, look at me!
Yeah, in this case, it turned out to be short-lived, but it's as if he's saying, yeah, I'm back in Hollywood, I have a studio at my disposal, look at me. I mean, Robert Altman does something similar in The Player, I think.
Which was his comeback picture, unlike Orson Welles' one.
Yeah.
Which is that in The Player, Altman does a long take where characters are talking about long takes and the best ones, and it also sets up this world of the studio backlot.
Yeah, and in fact, it opens with the clapper, and you hear him say action, and it's like him saying, here I am, I'm reclaiming my art.
And you could also trace that back to like Day for Night, which also starts with like an incredibly long take, where it's also on a film set, and you just see all the pieces kind of playing together on this like fake movie that's taking place in this Truffaut universe.
I think what the long take is used for mostly is to give this sense of you are there immersion. I mean, we didn't talk about The Cranes Are Flying, which is another movie by Mikhail Kalatozov, the director of I Am Cuba. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, by the way. There's a not especially impressive long take in that movie, but it's in there on a battlefield that kind of immerses you into the battlefield environment. But maybe a a more famous example would be Children of Men.
Yeah, Children of Men is like the post-2000, like Martin Scorsese long take obsession for film school students.
Clive Owen running across the battlefield while bombs are going off all around him, and then he goes into that bombed-out building and goes up the stairs.
Or the scene where he's in the car and they keep like backing up and going forward, and as people are coming from them at every side.
You know, in a way, I think the effect of that scene is a bit different.
Yes.
Because the first time I saw Children of Men, I didn't notice that car scene was a long take.
But I mean, like, what that scene achieves is this level of like claustrophobia, right? Because if you watch that scene again, unless I'm mistaken, it never leaves that car. Like, it's going to the front and the back, and that's basically the camera moves that it's making.
It gives you a kind of powerlessness because you can't really see, who these attackers are who are coming from the outside. But also the way, for a couple minutes before, the way the camera moves through the car, like, it gives you a false sense of security.
Mm-hmm. Like, nothing can happen until there's a cut.
Yeah.
But then when there's no cut and stuff is happening, you're like, all right, I'm in this filmmaker's hands. They can do anything. Even if you don't realize it, there's a feeling of claustrophobia and you can't see what's going on. And it's all defined by, I believe the camera is also moving in a way that's not following action. It's just turning kind of on its own axis.
That's right.
As if like, okay, I'm going to move past this. So you don't know what's going to happen next until I come back here.
And the way he did it, I think, was that he mounted a camera on a zip line on top of the car and sort of remote controlled it.
And I think that that's one of the issues with long takes, is that they're not only like, wow, I can't believe they did that, is it also takes the viewer a little bit out of it and you go, wow, how did they do that?
Yeah.
Is that you're sitting there and once you realize that this has been going on for a long time, you ask yourself, how could they have done this?
But I actually think that car scene in Children of Men is quite successful because, as I said, when I saw it for the first time, I didn't realize what was happening.
But I don't think that the latter scene in the movie works as well as that car scene because there is a kind of disconnect from what's going on when you realize like, oh, wow, they're not going to cut. So you become aware of what mistakes have they made and when is the cut going to come?
Well, I think maybe my favorite You Are There long take is the one in one of our favorite movies, Hard Boiled.
Oh, yeah.
Which is actually a cheat because there is a cut in it, but it's carefully
There's actually
hidden.
multiple cuts in Hard Boiled. This is something that like I always ask myself when I watch these long takes is how important is it that they achieved it correctly and they didn't, like you said, cheat? Because at first, like, my gut reaction is like, oh, well, that's not real. Like, you cheated that to get that effect, because then that removes the level of, wow, they did that all in one go. When you watch Hard Boiled, even the lengths of the shot as it is without any cuts is insane. The number of stunts and stuff like that they have in there.
I mean, I think there are some long takes where I would be disappointed if it were faked.
Oh, really? Like what?
I mean, I'm not sure if the one in Children of Men, maybe.
Yeah.
But the one in Hard Boiled, where there's the shootout in the hospital, and then Tony Leung accidentally shoots a cop, and then he goes with Chow Yun-fat into the elevator, and then they, have a moment when he's freaking out in the elevator, and then the elevator opens on, one of the upper floors, then they go back out and start shooting people again. I don't care as much that it's a cheat, because I feel like it works anyway. Like, what it's really about is not so much the virtuosity of it, but with what the character did and what he was feeling in that moment. And so when he goes into the elevator and he has this moment of
reflection,
this moment where he has to talk to Chow Yun-fat about what he's done, like, you're living with him in that moment.
Yeah, I mean, like, the action film is the genre, I would say, where long takes appear the most. It's the action film, and it's also this is my first film, and I'm making like a Sundance drama. Those are the two extremes that this long take appear in. Because in the art house drama, it's a filmmaker going, look at me. And in an action film, the idea of action and physical movement can be translated directly to the way that the camera is moving.
Certain silent comedies as well, by the way. Like, the length of the shots in a movie like City Lights are very long, because it's all about, like, the balletic grace of his motion in that movie. But, in an action movie, a movie like The Protector with Tony Jaa.
Oh, that long take is insane.
It has that very famous long take where he's running up this pagoda, basically, breaking one arm after another as
and like tossing people over it and stuff like that.
And it's about, isn't it amazing? not so much the filmmaking, but the performance.
It's also the idea of exhaustion. When you watch him go, you see him sweating and you see him doing all this stuff. And there's some flub things in there, like they didn't quite get them perfectly, but that just adds to the realism of what you're seeing, because there's no hidden cuts in Tom Yun-gun or The Protector in that shot.
So there are some long takes that are, I mean, a lot of long takes are basically a stunt.
Yes.
And sometimes it's a stunt for the filmmaker, but sometimes it's a stunt for the performer. So, for example, Les Miserables with Anne Hathaway.
Yes.
She won the Oscar, I think,
based on that one long take.
On that one long take where she sings, I Dreamed a Dream. Yeah.
But I wonder, like, why the long take did get so much currency, especially I would say like 80s onward, because like long takes are something that existed forever. Like live television, like when TV was coming up, like all of that stuff was done in one go. Just theater in of itself is a long take, but it's not as impressive as when it's done in cinema.
I think just because we know that cinema is a big cumbersome art form. We know how heavy the cameras are. We know that lighting is difficult.
Yeah. But like it's funny that like on Tom Yun-gun, the person who suffered the most in that movie was the Steadicam operator, because that thing is heavy, and if you watch the behind the scenes, he has to run up these stairs and he's just like sweating and gasping and stuff like that.
That's also an amazing thing about I Am Cuba, by the way. In I Am Cuba, he apparently had the camera.
Well, they didn't even have Steadicams back then.
They had big fucking heavy cameras.
Yeah.
Apparently he had it like rigged to his vest, and then there would be a complex network of pulleys and cranes.
Yes.
and like hooks that an army of assistants would manipulate.
There's an insane shot in I Am Cuba where it starts on a funeral on the street, goes up into a building across a bunch of people, and then goes out the window and starts to follow the funeral, which means that there's a guy just dangling in the air holding that camera as it's going across. And this is communist Cuba. That guy's probably dead. It probably ended the take with him just falling.
Well, good. He's a goddamn communist.
But we've been talking about the long take, I think, in the idea of like virtuosity. Like, look at these camera moves and look at it going up or down and across and all this stuff and what's happening on it. But when you look at classic Hollywood, like a lot of these long takes are not what you would think that they are, like something like Gun Crazy, which is the Joseph H. Lewis picture that has a famous long take, which is essentially just static in the back of the car. The camera actually moves forward and back a little bit, but it's mostly just like locked down, and you follow these two people as they rob a bank. And the impact of it comes from the fact that you're trapped, like in Children of Men, in this car, unable to escape. As stuff is going on around the car, there's no cut to release that pressure.
Yeah, but, you know, Gun Crazy is a very unusual film. In most Hollywood films of the 30s and 40s, the editing is supposed to be invisible.
Yes.
And I mean, a lot of theorists would tell you that the thing that differentiates cinema from other art forms is the montage.
Yeah, well, I mean, André Bazin, the guy who was like the grandpappy of the French New Wave, he was all about the idea of cinema not being intrusive to the viewer. That stuff, in his opinion, would play better if it was in long takes, when you didn't realize there were long takes.
He liked the idea of cinema as capturing realism.
Yes.
Which is, I think, an ideological difference between him and somebody like Jean-Luc Godard, or also Sergei Eisenstein. They're people who are interested in how, like, one shot juxtaposed with the next shot can create an idea.
But then you have people like Max Ophuls, who they would create films that takes that would go on forever, that would like have insane tracks. And they're not filmmakers that we really think about, because those takes are not always really showy. They're just long and they go all over the place, but it's mostly about shifting perspective as opposed to look at me.
I think from the classical studio era, the quintessential long take movie is Alfred Hitchcock's Rope.
Yes.
Which, I mean, his dream was to make a movie that was just one continuous take, but
He failed. There's some hard cuts in there.
well, I mean, he failed because you know, a reel of film in those days could only accommodate 10 minutes. So, you know, every 10 minutes there would be a very obviously disguised cut.
There's
but
actually
it was supposed to be in real time.
I watched it recently, and there's actually some hard cuts where it like cuts to a different angle in the room, which is that like the most frustrating thing you can see in a movie, which is someone trying a long take and you're like, you didn't get it. Like you have to punch into something and then go back to the long take to continue that shot.
But I think, you know, he was interested in the long take because he was interested in why can't film do what theater does.
Yes. And I think that Rope is actually a very successful experiment in that regard, because there's, I think, 2 or 3 hard cuts. And like one of those hard cuts is very specific, which is it's cutting as if it's like bam, like, look, like, this is important. And it's like Jimmy Stewart realizing that something is wrong at the party that he's at. And while it is like a really artificial film, it's also a film that is moving all over the place. Like, if Hitchcock loved the idea of film being theater, he also loved the idea of controlling the viewer's point of view and going like, oh, now you have to look at this, now you have to look at that, now you can see this, but you can't see that over there, in a way that's more suspenseful than cutting directly, because the viewer is aware that you're moving into something or moving away from something, while a cut will just bring you right to it.
We've been talking a lot about the long take as a manifestation of the director's authorship, the director's presence, but there are certain, especially experimental films, where it's like the director ceding control. Now, Andy Warhol, I think, is the most obvious example, because he would often make these films 30 minutes long, you know, so one 16 millimeter reel of film.
That he would actually kind of make into a 30-minute reel of film. There's a way to do it that you could kind of like attach them together.
Right.
So you could get that 30 minutes without having to cut the camera.
But, you know, it would just be a static shot, and he would have, you know, one person or maybe several people in front of it. He would basically say, okay, what do you think of this?
Yeah. I think we kind of talked about this during the Chantal Akerman episode as well, because she's a filmmaker who really enjoyed showing things for a long time, where at first you're like, all right, what am I supposed to be looking at? Okay, this is not cutting. All right, what am I thinking about now? So every viewer will have like a different experience with the movie.
It becomes more participatory, and it also, I think Chantal Akerman is the quintessential filmmaker for making you realize that not all boredom is the same.
That's right.
Like boredom can have texture, boredom can be used for different purposes. But I mean, aside from Chantal Akerman, there are certain filmmakers who use duration. Somebody like the Taiwanese filmmaker Tsai Ming Lang. You know, I saw a film of his at TIFF a few years ago called Journey to the West, where one of the early shots is a very close-up shot of Denis Lavant's face. It just holds on it forever. And then eventually, you know, a single tear rolls down Denis Lavant's cheek. And, you know, within the headspace you're in while you're watching that movie, that becomes like an action scene.
Yes.
That's like, here is this explosion of activity, and it's a tear.
We talked about it when we did the we talked about that when we did the experimental film episode. The idea that, like, even when you watch Empire and you're just looking at this building and suddenly a bird flies by, you're like, whoa, yes, yes, that there's motion on screen.
Well, I also think, like, some of these, you know, some of the really hard art filmmakers, there can be something enveloping in the long take. Tsai Ming Lang's film Stray Dogs, the penultimate shot is, I think, a 15-minute shot of two people staring at something off screen. And, you know, there's something about the lighting in it, and there's something about, you know, the sound of the train that passes behind, where, like, I'm not sure quite how to describe it in a rational way, but I feel like I'm in that tunnel with them.
I feel that, like, the experimental film have the same problem that, like, new filmmakers have, which is the idea that the long take can mean something in of itself. Like, it will gain meaning the longer you look at it. And it's like, that's not always true. Sometimes it's just like, why is this long? Like, you haven't given any kind of valid reason or story reason or thematic reason for it to have this length, for me to become aware of it, and for me to go, what is going on?
Name names, you bastard.
I can't think of any specific
I know what you're talking about, though, definitely.
Yeah. You know what I'm talking about, right? Yeah. And it's the same thing with, like, show-offy filmmakers. I feel like Brian De Palma, I mean, he's a filmmaker that I really like, but that one of the things that he brought to cinema was this idea of style for style's sake, that, like, that is the content of the movie, and because of that, it kind of affected other people negatively, where they go, well, I want to be Brian De Palma, I want to show off, I want to be the auteur of my film.
Yeah, I mean, I like some of Brian De Palma's films.
Blow Up is great.
Yeah, Blow Up's great, and I enjoy some of the, like, excess of his style and the joy of his style, but, you know, a movie that I don't respect a whole lot is Birdman. That's a movie that's supposed to be like one continuous take. Of course it isn't really, but I guess Alejandro Gonzalez Iñárritu would tell you that the visual style of the movie is supposed to place you in the subjective headspace of the Michael Keaton character.
Yeah, but it doesn't. Because you're just disconnected from what's going on. You're like, wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it shows his point of view at all.
No.
It seems totally divorced from it. And so it just becomes this kind of flailing, show-offy exercise.
And I feel like every film that he's made since then, like The Revenant, has that same problem where it's like, look at me, look what I'm doing, which is probably the tagline of this episode, should be like, look at me, it's the longest take in the world.
Yeah.
But as far as, like, other favorite long take stuff, One that no one ever mentions, and I looked on lists online while we were doing this episode to make sure that like I didn't miss anything, is a little film called Running Time, starring my man Bruce Campbell.
Nice.
It's 70 minutes long, and it's one seemingly continuous long take that follows Bruce Campbell getting out of jail, meeting up with his friends, robbing a bank, and the kind of aftermath of that. It's one of those like little like pictures that I feel works in the way that it doesn't reach too far. Like it has this main idea and it just executes it. That's why I appreciate it. Even though, I'll warn you, the first time I watched it and it ended, I went, that's it? So be ready for that.
My girlfriend Dancy reminded me of Gus Van Sant's Elephant.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
In relation to Goodfellas, because they're both movies, Elephant, like Goodfellas, has a lot of scenes where, the camera will follow somebody as they walk a long distance. And they're both very much about mobility and its relation to power. But the power is totally opposite. In Elephant, something about the long takes show you the limit of the space that these kids can occupy, the limit of their world, and it makes you realize how much is out of bounds for them.
At that period of time, Gus Van Sant was kind of obsessed with the idea of this long take. Like Jerry, the movie that stars Matt Damon and Casey Affleck, which was them just walking through a desert until they died in these like endlessly long takes. And then the capper of that trilogy, Last Days, the Kurt Cobain movie, where you just follow him in the day before that he commits suicide.
Jerry, I think, was very much under the influence of Bela Tarr, the long take.
I'm a big fan of Bela Tarr.
Yeah, I've only seen The Turin Horse, but I really loved it.
Yeah, and that one does have that long take style, especially the opening of it, which follows a guy just kind of like riding his horse as the camera swoops all around him. Then you have something like Satan Tango, which is just mostly following people walking down the street as like leaves blow around them.
I've got to say Workmeister Harmonies, because I know it's very well regarded, and also it's 39 shots in 145 minutes.
I mean, I just watched a movie by I can't say his name, he's a Greek filmmaker, The Traveling Players, which is like this epic movie that does one of those long take things where a take will take you through the past and present without a cut. And the only issue with that film is that you're watching it and you're like, I have no historical base in anything that's going on. So you can only connect with it as far as the emotions that you can see. I mean, we didn't even talk about Russian Ark, which is like the famous long take
Which
movie.
I have to admit I haven't seen.
Really?
I know, I'm very ashamed. But that's an example where it's going through
a museum.
The Russian Hermitage Museum. And you kind of get a sense of like the history of Russia while you're traveling through in that one long take. And I haven't seen it. I can't really say.
I just watched it yesterday. You'll be watching and going, I don't know who these people are.
Okay, that's probably true. But I guess it's probably the idea of like time as this continuum.
Yeah, and I think that's like when people want to make like a movie that's one long take, like Victoria, which came out a few years ago, which is another bank robbery film that is done without any cuts. And that movie, I think, works as a story, even though, it's 2 hours long and it feels long, as well as a technical exercise. Because you watch it and you go, how did they not cut or like screw up this film? Like, that's what's crazy about it. And as far as myself, like we talked about, like Teddy Bomb has a long take in it. Of course it had to have one because it's my first movie.
You were a young man, yeah.
And that was because where we were shooting, we didn't have permission to shoot there. We were shooting in a school, so we couldn't have like guys running around with like knives or stuff like that. So I shot it from the POV of a character, and so it's the POV going through the school. So you're not only making the viewer looking through the eyes of the bad guy and you don't know where the hero is, it also gives me the opportunity to make it super long and not get in trouble if anybody comes around and goes, hey, what are you doing?
Yeah, it's that fun shot where like Peter's character grabs Pierce Dirks and like pushes him up against a locker, and you see it from his point of view. Yeah, and
that also has a thing which I stole from Lady in the Lake, which was like a detective adaptation back in the day, which is like a character looks at themselves in the mirror, and you just put the person like a little bit to the left of the camera, and that way like you don't see anybody holding the camera, but it looks like they're looking at themselves in the reflection, which is always fun. Like that's just technical like show-offy stuff.
Oh, and I guess while we're just saying a few more favorite long takes,
Impossible Horror.
Yeah. But I think I might also throw in Antonioni's The Passenger. The penultimate shot of that movie where the camera slowly, I think over 10 minutes or so, goes through the bars of a window and then turns around and you see that, while the take has been going on, a death has occurred. And the big question that you ask while watching it is, how did the camera get through those bars?
It's because they switched the sets around completely. Completely. I love the shot in Tarkovsky's Nostalgia where the guy is walking across the pool and he's holding a candle and he can't let it go out, and the camera keeps pushing in and out as he's trying to make this very slow motion without letting that flame disappear.
And then he gets towards the end and
you gotta watch the movie. Go, no spoilers.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't even mention, like, Johnny Toe's Breaking News has an insane opening take, which is a long gunfight that not only sets up all the players in the scenario, but also lets the whole action scene play out in its entirety.
Oh, Jean-Luc Godard's Weekend.
Yep, that tracking across all the cars. And that's the perfect one to end on, because end of cinema.
We'll be here all day if we keep going.
Yep. All right, so as per usual, you can send us letters at importantcinemaclubpodcast@gmail.com. And this week, we did a Patreon episode on The Total Filmmaker by the person that anybody thinks about when they think about The Total Filmmaker, Jerry Lewis.
That's right. It's his textbook for how to make films, which was created out of the lectures that he gave at the University of Southern California in the early 1970s, and it was published as a book, and it's actually a pretty well-regarded book.
And me and Will talk about it at length and kind of revisit Jerry's oeuvre a little bit.
Because, longtime fans will recall that Jerry Lewis was our very first episode.
And I don't think we've returned to Jerry that much other than we're very sad that he passed away. And that was pretty much it.
Passing references,
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, he's never far from my thoughts.
But in this episode, you get, like, uncut Jerry.
That's right.
And so it's $5 a month. You get 4 episodes every month. It's patreon.com/importantcinemaclubpodcast. And I'd just like to mention the new Patreon subscribers that we got, because we really appreciate it. So a shout out to David Isbiter, David Laurie, Jeffrey Sigrist, Turka Yelinin, R. Marco Balaband, Jacob Wallingford, J.P. McDevitt, Matt H., Edward Kelly, Stuart Chivers, Alex Sinesi, and Ian Dillingham. Thank you very much. And become a Patreon subscriber.
Get your name mispronounced on the podcast.
That's right. So, as far as letters go, we have one here from Michael Carr. It goes, very nice podcast. P.S. More Matthew Kumar. Hey there, Justin and Will.
Matthew has his own podcast.
I'm a big fan of the podcast, having just spent the last months or so listening to every episode in reverse order, and a couple of them twice.
Wow.
Oh, man. Thank you.
That's far more of me than I would want.
I love the way you can mix highbrow discussion with lowbrow humor. That's us. Where else can I hear someone make a Borat reference while discussing Bresson? I think that was the episode, but please edit my letter accordingly if incorrect, as I hate for my letter to tarnish your impeccable record of accuracy. Whoa, he puts that word in quotes, with a lapse of lazy fact-checking.
I can't remember. I feel like Borat is something I'm always thinking about.
Yeah, but I've kind of, like, tamped it down on the podcast. Will basically starts every episode by going, my wife, just to get it out of the system.
When Justin read the first part of that letter and he said, very nice podcast, you know what I was thinking, don't you?
What?
I thought, very nice.
Of course. You truly are the champagne of film podcasts.
Oh, shucks.
Effervescent, intoxicating, and likely to cause a mess if you get overexcited. Very nice.
Holy shit.
Your episode on Matt Farley was a watershed moment in my appreciation of the world of indie filmmaking.
Oh, did you hear that, Matt?
Ah, that's great, yeah. Speaking of which, I would love to purchase a copy of Teddy Bomb and Possible Horror, Justin, as by this point, I feel like it's almost a sign reading. It is, and you can buy it online. Also, you should totally sue Blumhouse for upgrade. Yeah, I should. Now, finally, I come to the postscript title of my letter, which is to request more Matthew Kumar guest spots on the podcast, please. Or perhaps even more Will Sloan guest spots on Loose Cannons, which I'm slowly working through in between Important Cinema Club episodes as a kind of methadone treatment for my heroin-like addiction to ICC.
Hear that, Matthew? It's methadone to ICC's heroin.
Now, I told Matthew this, and he said, I feel like Loose Cannons is more like the crack cocaine compared to Important Cinema Club. Just insanity for 30 minutes.
I say the letter writer has a good idea there. Let's get me on the Loose Cannons podcast mixing it up.
While the banter between you two is amazing, something about hearing Matthew's deep analysis of populist trash like Twins comes crashing against the rocks of critical thinking and film theory that is Will Sloan makes for stimulating and hilarious listening. Having said that, Justin, you are obviously the man glue that holds the uneasy menage a trois together with your limitless enthusiasm, so please don't feel left out of my gushing praise, as I want to lather you in as much as the other two.
Menage a trois, lather. They're just getting very sensual.
There's a reason that Will and Matthew don't do too many podcasts together, is that on Loose Cannons, I tend to bully Matthew, and when Matthew comes to this podcast, he tends to bully Will. So,
and then who do I have?
Exactly.
I think
Luke Savage.
I think I have to start bullying you more.
Yeah.
And then it'll be like a snake eating its own tail. But no, I love Matthew, and I think he's great whenever he's on the podcast.
And if you are not a Patreon subscriber, letter writer, you should go listen to our Christmas episode, because there's a very hilarious, tense fight between Matthew and Will about a subject I will not mention, but then when you hear it, it's very funny. These things usually end with a question. I wanted to ask a Godzilla question, as though I know the special is locked in for the 200th episode. Yep.
That's right.
The freaking shout-outs to Godzilla Final Wars and the Donger. He's talking about our man, Don Fry. I've decided to start working my way through the Godzilla films, but there are just too many. Could you suggest which films I should watch and in which order? Like, which are the important ones?
First of all, there are not too many.
No.
Every single one is a masterpiece.
We did a Loose Cannons episode where me and Matthew and a bunch of my friends did a Godzilla marathon, and we had almost like a perfect collection of Godzilla movies in that, and I don't remember every one. I would say watch the Godzilla, the first one. Mm-hmm. King Kong versus Godzilla, first Godzilla in color, first one that he really fights another monster. He does it in Godzilla Raids again, but it's not the same when it's King Kong. After that, you get into the like Jun Fukuda era.
Well, I think watch Godzilla versus Mothra.
Yes,
that's probably the best of the 1960s movies. Mm-hmm. In the kind of kooky 70s era,
the craziest one is the one that MST3K made popular, which is Godzilla versus Megalon. Mm-hmm. You get a lot of stock footage in that one, but if that's like the only one you're watching, you're gonna get like the craziest example of that one thing.
I think it's pretty fun if you can find like the good widescreen version of it, because it used to be in a lot of terrible pan and scan copies. But that's the one where Godzilla slides across the landscape on his tail.
That's right. I would also recommend Godzilla's Revenge, which is not one that's held in very high regard, which is Ishiro Honda, the director of the original Godzilla, made kind of like a kiddie cut-up movie of all the previous ones. Mm-hmm. I recommend it only because it's much better than people give it credit for, because it is a story of a latchkey kid who's living in this desolation where like nobody's around, everything's kind of gray, and he has to go to this magical fantasy land where he can hang out with
Minya, the son of Godzilla.
Yeah, who kind of talks like this in the movie.
It's also kind of fun as like a best of Godzilla.
Exactly.
It's got I think I might also suggest, it's got a lot of slow spots, but Invasion of Astro Monster, also known as Godzilla vs. Monster Zero.
Yeah.
That's one where Godzilla goes to space. Can't argue with that.
And I would not recommend Destroy All Monsters unless you're going through all of them, because that one is boring.
But, you know, once you get into the later years, I think two that I might recommend are, you know, in addition to Godzilla Final Wars, Godzilla 2000, I think has a lot of stuff in it.
Yep. Godzilla 2000 is an interesting kind of transition point into like the 2000 era, or as they're known, the Millennium series of Godzilla films. I would recommend in the 90s. I mean, if you're going to do 2000, you don't want to do Godzilla 85 because they're basically the same. But I would recommend Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, and this is the 90s one. It's very confusing because the Mechagodzilla films all kind of sound the same. But this is one that has almost everything in it. And as far as the Millennium series, I would also recommend Godzilla All-Out Monster Attack.
Oh, yeah. Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah. Giant Monsters All Attack.
Yeah. Because that's the one that was directed by an outside filmmaker, because usually it was like Toho Studio Men. It was made by the guy who did the great 90s Gamer series. So it has kind of like a meaner edge than the other movies. And also has Godzilla in his most terrifying form, where he is the representation of the dead souls of Hiroshima, and he has white eyes.
Yeah, and it's also got a ton of monster stuff in it, which is really,
so much fun
really
stuff.
What you want from a Godzilla movie.
And of course, Godzilla Final Wars, the greatest movie of all time. So hopefully we gave you enough there to go and tackle them.
We named like all of them, the series, practically.
I would not recommend going from the beginning to the ending. That is, that's a rough journey.
Well, I don't think anybody's discovered the Godzilla movies from beginning to end. Like, you know, when we were kids, when anybody was kids, it was like you would see, you know, just whichever ones were the easiest to come by, whichever ones fell in front of you first.
Yeah, and I feel like if you go with those highlights, you can then like go into different pockets and stuff like that to discover other fun ones.
Such a rich and multi-layered saga.
I'm very excited to get to that 200th episode, which, you know, feels like it's a million years away, but then we'll be there like we were with that Jackie Chan episode.
That's right. I mean, it's possible we'll be doing this podcast for the rest of our lives. Yeah. Have you thought about that? It could happen.
I mean, if people start paying us enough that we can like live off of
Well, if we can quit our jobs, that'd be
perfect. As we've said, we say it every like dozen episodes. If there's a rich billionaire out there who just wants to make like thousands of dollars each month, we will do this We'll do it in your house.
And, if sexual favors are required, I'm sure it's negotiable.
P.S. Sorry for the ridiculous long letter. I have many more questions. And most importantly, fuck the big chill.
I forgot about that. Yeah.
You can't always get what you want.
Imagine I'm Jeff Goldblum and the corners of my mouth are just turning up at the sound of that.
Anyway,
we talked about that movie on our TIFF podcast.
Thank you very much for your letter. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but we really appreciate it. Mickey Carr. And we have a second letter. This one's really short. It goes, "Hello, lads." It's from Jasmine Chorley.
Oh, my good friend.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
That's why it's a very direct cut. Long-time listener, first-time emailer. In episode number 23, What is Canadian Cinema? You mentioned that in the plot of Men with Brooms, the dead coach's ashes are put into the curling rock. How is that physically possible? I know that if anyone can answer this question, it is Paul Gross scholars Will and Justin. Thank you kindly, Jasmine.
Perhaps they hollowed it out.
That's right. Or perhaps they bought a curling making factory and then poured the ashes in the mold.
Yeah. It's funny hearing episode 22. It's like, isn't it wild that there were conversations that we had 2 years ago that are just like...
that people are listening to now?
Yeah, that's insane.
We're probably not very woke in the early episodes.
Yeah.
This is a good letter because I recently went to a Doors Open at the University of Toronto where you could walk through the rare books library, and they had a thing laid out of film memorabilia. I couldn't believe that on this table of film memorabilia, the script for Paul Gross's Men with Brooms.
Oh...
Just
what a
heavenly.
thrill.
I reached over to touch it. They're like, no!
It's like the world's shittiest Planet Hollywood.
Do you think that they went through their archives and are like, I guess people like Men with Brooms? Nobody likes Men with Brooms, do they? Are there fans out there?
I believe his name is Mr. Paul Gross.
That's right. And as per usual, you can follow me at DeClueJ on Twitter.
I'm at Will Sloan ESQ.
And Justin DeClue on Letterboxd, and that's DECLOUX. And make sure to go and rate and review us on iTunes. Said it last week, nobody did.
Ha. So what are we doing next week, Justin?
Next week, we're going back to classic Hollywood, or some would say Hollywood's best year, 1939, the year that gave us Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz.
Lots of other movies too, but it's the year that, especially when we were growing up, people would constantly say this is when classic Hollywood hit its zenith. I think so. I think they did. Didn't they?
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, I looked online. There's multiple books about that year.
Yeah, because other movies that came out that year include Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Ninotchka, I don't know, more movies I'm forgetting.
So we're going to talk about a year, and we're going to watch Gone with the Wind.
I'm not looking forward to that.
And The Wizard of Oz, a film that I'm not that big a fan of.
And The Wizard of Oz, probably the first movie I ever loved.
Really? I'm looking forward to that conversation.
Really little kid, yeah.
Come back next week. Until then, my name's Justin DeClue.
I'm Will Sloan.
Thanks for listening.
So I see that you saw Solo, A Star Wars Story, a film by Ron Howard this week.
Yeah, a film that when me and my friends were talking about it a few months ago, I went, I think this will be the first Star Wars film I don't see on its opening day. I was very adamant about it. I'm like, I'm not seeing it. Guess what I saw on opening day? Because all my friends were like, I'm getting tickets. You want one, Justin? Come on, let's go. And I kept going, it's a Ron Howard movie. It's not going to be good. I did a whole episode on Ron Howard where I watched 15 of his movies, just struggling.
You went a little crazy that week, I felt.
to find one where I'm like, this is good. Spoiler, I didn't. And so the idea of Ron Howard directing a Han Solo movie is probably the least exciting thing I could imagine.
But then, even less exciting, because famously he took over the reins from two other filmmakers who had a more distinctive vision.
Yeah, Chris Lord and Phil Miller, the showrunners of Clone High and the directors of Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, 21 Jump Street, 22 Jump Street, and the Lego Movie. Filmmakers that have never had a flop or even a critically unsuccessful film.
And it seems, based on the many kind of behind-the-scenes reports about this movie, that they were going for a bit of a jokier, more of a Guardians of the Galaxy tone.
AKA every single movie they've made before they went and directed Solo. And they were fired, I have to say, 2 weeks or a week before filming was done, which in terms of big Hollywood productions, that's not a lot of screen time.
So I think this Solo movie is interesting because it isn't doing very well. I mean, it had a $80 million opening weekend, but it's flopping overseas. And there is no excitement around it. It's come into theaters with just this air of doom around it.
Well, I think that from the get-go, the idea of a Han Solo prequel film is exciting for no one. Yeah. Because, like, even me, I love Star Wars. I love Han Solo. Why would I want to see how he got his name Solo?
Well, aren't you a little curious in that line when he said, I won that ship off you fair and square? Don't you want to hear the story about that?
No, I do not.
Don't you want to see a fun adventure with this guy that you know is going to get stabbed later?
And I remember that, like, when they hired Phil Lord and Chris Miller, those are essentially the only directors they could hire to make me excited about this. Mm-hmm. Because you know that the way that they would have approached it would have been, like, irreverent and kind of making fun of it, but at the same time, treating it with respect as far as, like, emotions and storytelling goes. Because even if you look at something that's as crashly commercial as the Lego Movie, like, it treats the emotional stakes of its characters with a seriousness that, like, if it had just been all over the place, just a parody, would have not worked.
The crazy thing about this Han Solo movie to me is that it's kind of coasting along on the nostalgia and the goodwill of a movie that came out 40 years ago.
Yeah, I think it's the idea that Solo is so much in the popular consciousness that as far as money people go, and George Lucas was supposedly writing this, like, before he sold Lucasfilm to Disney, and they must think that it's an easy sell. Like, this must have been for them, like, this will guarantee to make money because people like this character.
But I mean, on some level, like, selling something on nostalgia is not sustainable because, you know, The Force Awakens comes out and it's like, oh boy, we're going to get to see these characters again. And then The Last Jedi comes out and it's like, oh boy, we're going to get to see Luke Skywalker again. And then, well, sorry, I had my Han Solo fix. Show me something new.
And the thing about Solo is that it's a fine movie that when you watch it, all you can think about is, this would have been way more fun with the other two guys. Mm-hmm. Like, it's the decision that they made of, do you want something that people don't expect, or do you want what people expect? Mm-hmm. And I think that as studio executives, they completely, like, made the wrong choice. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons that supposedly, like, Phil Lord and Chris Miller got booted was that Lawrence Kasdan and his son were the one that wrote the script for Solo. So this is the old guard of Lucasfilm, the guy that wrote Empire Strikes Back. He wrote drafts of Indiana Jones, and he was supposedly really pissed that they were going off of his script.
Yeah, these guys are known for their improv.
Yeah, and stuff like that, and, like, going from weird angles.
Another thing that's weird about it is they released it, 6 months after the last Star Wars movie. Mm-hmm. So, there used to be a time, I mean, as recently as 6 months ago, when a new Star Wars movie was exciting. An event.
Yes.
And now it's, the brand is getting watered down. And also, had they delayed it longer, people would have had time to forget all this negative publicity, all this behind-the-scenes stuff. Because I don't think there was even a trailer for this movie until about 2 months ago.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of people are writing like, oh, Han Solo, it's underperforming, blah, 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 it's flopping overseas. Like, none of this matters to a company as big as Disney or Lucasfilm. What matters is how the film is received. And the fact that it's not even received critically very well, like, that's a huge problem. Mm-hmm. And it's just them going in a direction that was a mistake, which is difficult, right? Because now these executives are in a situation where a vocal minority hated Last Jedi because it was too different and it did a bunch of crazy stuff. And people don't want, like, mushed over leftovers. It's kind of like that episode of The Simpsons where it's like, wait, so you want crazy wizards that are grounded in real life and stuff like that. And I think that there's a way to do those things. Basically, what Lucasfilm has to realize is that the old Star Wars fans are complaining about The Last Jedi. It's not theirs anymore, which is what that movie is about.
Uh-huh. I probably won't see the Han Solo movie.
No, you won't.
Isn't
and especially now that we've talked about it.
Yeah, feels good. Feels liberating.
Yeah, you don't need to see it. Like, I would say, if anybody said, hey, should I see Solo? I go, you're a big Star Wars fan? They go, yeah, I really like Star Wars. I would go, well, you don't have to see it.